Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action Podcast again, back with another article review from 2020. In this one, I want to talk about the issue of challenge in practice and training and how important it is, and a nice study that shows this effect. So, as Guagnoli and Lee first formalized in their well-known paper on the what's now called the challenge point hypothesis, we know that one of the keys to motor learning is challenging the person at the right level, right? Having the right level of task difficulty. And one of the key points that they make, and we talk about a lot in motor learning, is that the level of difficulty for performance, looking good and doing well in practice, is not the same as the level of difficulty needed for learning, right? Getting better in the long run, right? Looking good in practice and doing everything perfectly, which would have a lower task difficulty level, doesn't usually lead to long-term benefits, right? There is an optimal challenge point where you're actually pushing the person a little bit into having them make some mistakes. And kind of a general guideline that I like to use when people ask me, what's the optimal level? It depends on the sport and how it's measured. But in general, if you have a person kind of failing 20 to 30% of the time, so they're successful, around 75 to 80% of the time, that's kind of seems to be the optimal challenge point for learning, for getting progress. And if you're interested in the challenge point hypothesis, I talk about it in detail on the podcast in episode number 105. This kind of effect, this effect of challenging people optimally, one of the, relating this to my own research, this was essentially the secret sauce in my baseball training study. So, for those that don't know, this is a study I published in 2017 where I looked at the transfer of training from using a baseball batting virtual environment that I developed to real baseball batting. I compared a bunch of different groups with a control group and a group that did extra real batting practice. And what I found was that the group that what I call the adaptive group did better on virtual hitting tests, real hitting tests, in league statistics after in the actual competition, and were reached higher levels 5 years later, either college or pro levels. And as I said, the secret sauce to this was one of them was varying the difficulty of the hitting task in the training adaptively based on their performance. So keep progressively increasing it to challenge them. And the way that I did that was by changing the variability. So as they got better and better at hitting, I increased the range of speeds they hit against, and the range of different pitch locations, and the range of pitch types, and so on. And that's what's shown in that kind of staircase. So I was finding kind of the optimal level. So as I said, in that study, the challenging people at the right level was really the secret sauce for the success in the training, and through, in this case, through variability. The study I want to look at today from this year shows this effect nicely, and it kind of connects it with some kind of neurophysiology, neuroscience work. So I thought it would be interesting to talk about. This is a paper published in Nature Scientific Reports by Christensen et al. And one of the authors, Mike Gray, is one of my former colleagues from when I was at University of Birmingham. So in this study, it's actually a fairly straightforward study, but it's just, some of the best ones are, right? Simple kind of manipulations and measures. So what they did was have 24 test participants practice a task, which is basically the video game Breakout. Like if you're old enough as me, you probably remember this game. Basically, there's a video game where there's a little ball, simulated ball, the green dot, bouncing down, and you have to move a paddle to send it back up. And every time it hits one of those bricks at the top, it breaks the bricks, right? So you have to break all the bricks on the level without letting the ball go past your paddle, right? And it's a very straightforward video game. The way that it was done in this study was a person was seated and they were controlling the movement of the paddle by moving a trackball with their baby finger. Okay, so their baby finger is moving the trackball back and forth, which you can imagine makes it a bit more challenging. Okay. The key manipulation in the study was having two training groups, right? So two training groups. One of the groups, the difficulty level was constant throughout the training, which was 6 weeks long. So it stayed at the same level. To the other group, they progressively increased the difficulty based on their performance. In this case, difficulty was increased by either increasing the speed at which the ball would move or decreasing the width of the paddle, right? So, based on your performance on the last day of training, those things were changed progressively to keep you challenged and keep it more difficult. So that's the basic task that was used. The measures, obviously, they could measure performance, how well you did in the task, but the main thing kind of they added to this, and that's added to it, is they measured something called cortical spinal excitability, CSE. So there's multiple ways, the way that you do that standardly is you use a technique called TMS, okay? And that's what's shown in this picture. You have this coil that's delivering a magnetic signal stimulation over your brain. And it's positioned over the motor cortex. So it's actually stimulating the area of your brain that controls the movement of your left pinky finger, your left little finger. So what you do in TMS is you stimulate this area, and then you, as shown in this picture up here, you measure the EMG in the baby finger. Okay, and you get this what's called a recruitment curve, right? So what it's showing you is the amount of magnetic impulses on the x-axis, the EMG essentially is on the y-axis, right? So what it's showing essentially, the reason it's called a recruitment curve is because as you stimulate the area that controls the movement of your little finger more and more, you get more and more muscle activity in your little finger. You get more and more recruitment of the muscles in your hand. Okay, it's responding more. That's why it's called excitability. And the idea, and this has been shown in a few studies, that this excitability is related to learning, right? It's essentially a type of plasticity. The more excitable you are, the more malleable you are to changes, like learning new connections, right, between sensory areas and motor areas in your brain and things like that, right? So cortical spinal excitability is good, right? It's something we want. It seems to be really important for learning. So that was the basic task and the basic measures they used. The training was, outlined here. Basically, they, collected baseline data, levels of performance. Then they did 6 weeks of training with kind of these TMS measures in between. They then did 2 retention tests. They did retention tests at 8 days and 14 months. Okay. And importantly, interestingly, they measured retention using 2 levels of performance. So they had the game set on the difficulty level that the experiment started at, day 1. That's what they mean by day 1 level. And then they also tested people at the end level, which was the highest level that the people in the progressive training group reached. So it was a much more difficult task, right? So that's will be important. Okay, so that's the basic design. What did they find? Okay, well, in terms of performance, the top graph is showing you, so we have the first baseline date when they first showed up, 6 weeks later, retention, the first retention period and the second retention period. This top graph is showing you so PT is progressively trained, okay, the people that were getting their difficulty raised each session. Blue is non-progressively trained. What you can see is when you test people at the day 1 level, so you test people at a really easy level, you get no differences, which of course is what you expect, right? The expertise effects don't usually show up when you test people at really easy levels, right? Elite baseball, I could think of an example, but that's pretty obvious, right? The other graph in the bottom is showing what happens when you test the 2 groups at a higher level of difficulty. Okay, the level reached the end level. Okay? And what you can see is there's a clear difference at 6 weeks, the first retention period for the progressively trained group. Importantly, there seems to be a loss. This isn't retained in the long term and the longest retention period, which is something important to consider. And it's really highlights the reason why you do need to do retention tests, right, to see if these things stick. So it's not a limitation of a study. It's just kind of qualifies the findings a little bit. You wonder, why is this going away in the long term and what does it mean? probably means they need keep practicing in between those retentions. Okay, so this is basic performance. So this is basically the score on the game. How many bricks you take out with a single ball before you lose the ball. Okay. What's more, kind of the new twist to this is the corticospinal excitability. These are the recruitment curves, right? So on the bottom, we have the amount of stimulation to the brain area, right? On the top, we essentially have the amount of evoked potentials, the EEG activity. Well, you can see on the first day of training, the progressively trained and non-progressively trained, the blue and red, are basically the same, which is always a good thing in a learning study. You want people to start the same. But you can see quickly, 2 weeks later, 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, in retention, there's more recruitment going on in the people that are progressively trained, right? So there's more, with the same level of a stimulation, there's more muscle activity in their hand, in the area of the baby finger, right? So the area is more excitable. It's easier to get that area active. Okay, it requires less brain activity. So more muscles are recruited for the same amount of activity. So that's a very clear effect that we're showing, that being progressively changed, raising the challenge, is inducing this brain activity, neuroplasticity, this corticospinal plasticity, which you would expect would lead to better learning, and it clearly does. Okay. So I think this study nicely. So as I said, it's a pretty straightforward finding, but I think it's a very important one, right? It's so this plasticity, importantly, it's driven by learning, not performance, right? So if you don't challenge people, right, by increasing difficulty in practice, they're just performing, right? They're not going to get any better, and you have to challenge people to make them better. And you see that with the group that was non-progressively trained, they don't get this increase in brain plasticity, right? And that's actually consistent, the authors point out, with a lot of the previous lab studies, where people seem to get initial plasticity when you first train them on a skill. This is where you're training them without varying difficulty level. They get initial increase in corticospinal plasticity, but it seems to plateau, right? Because that's what you would expect, right? Is people get first started task is going to be difficult for them. It's what Lee in their challenge point hypothesis, they call the nominal task difficulty, or the functional task difficulty. Relative to your ability, it's going to be difficult. But as you get better and better, it's going to get easier and easier. So you're going to plateau. But what they also point out in this paper is that if you actually measure corticospinal excitability in elite people and elite musicians and athletes and so on, it tends to be higher than at lesser skill levels. And what you could argue is that's probably happening because they're engaging in deliberate practice, right? They're challenging themselves regularly. So that's, so this learning, getting better and better, challenging yourself, is driving this plasticity, not keeping things the same and just doing it in practice. They also make an important point for neurorehabilitation, so people recovering from stroke and things like that, right? Giving people repetitive exercises that are easy for them at the same level of difficulty is not going to likely lead to a really effective way to get functional changes, right? Improvements, right? Because you're not getting this corticospinal plasticity, this excitability, right? You're not driving that by challenging them. So I think, as I said, this is a nicely well-designed study to emphasize, what we know in motor learning, the importance of challenge, right? The importance of having practice where people are making mistakes. They're pushing people, making learning messy, as a lot of people like to say. Okay, that's it for this article review. As I said, if you're interested in the challenge point hypothesis, you can check out that episode on the podcast to go into their model in detail. So thank you for joining me, and cheers for now.